Have you received feedback that your characters are boring? Has a beta reader ever told you that your characters have the emotional feelings of a leaf blower? Are you writing characters that are boring? We're diving into how to tell if your characters are in fact boring, so let's head into the storm.
It's the raven's call, the werewolf's howl, the vampire's bite. You search through the woods for safety, but all you find is... Okay, rights.
Hello, writers. Welcome back to Spooky Writes. My name's Kemal Onor, and I'm a horror short story author. Today, we're going to be diving into the topic of how to tell if your characters are in fact boring, and how to stop writing boring characters. So in this video, I want to help you be able to identify if your own characters are boring, and I want to help you understand what makes a character boring, and I want to help you understand how you can make your boring characters more interesting. So make sure you stick around through the whole video because I'm going to be giving you lots of examples and I'm going to be covering a lot of topics. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and comment below. Help the channel grow. It means a lot to me. And so more importantly, I want to help you stop writing boring characters, because it doesn't matter how exciting your story is. If you have a character that is boring, readers aren't going to care about Bob and his adventures. No one's going to care about Bob the accountant on his epic adventure through the wastelands in search of the princess. If he's just a boring character, readers aren't going to appreciate this type of protagonist. So you have to write interesting characters. Now, it's important to know that boring is also a subjective term, just like many writing preferences. I personally don't want to hear a story about Bill and his adventures to pay the bills, being a Buffalo Bills fan from upstate New York. It just doesn't interest me. I don't think anyone would ever want to pick up a book that's titled The Adventures of Boring Bill. And so just like how you can have boring stories with boring plots, it's also completely possible to have boring characters, and a boring character is going to put a complete stop to any emotional attachment that a reader might have. A reader might be completely invested in the plot of your story or the plot of your novel, but if the protagonist is boring, there's not going to be that extra care that a reader would have. A reader is not going to be concerned about boring Bob and his cat collection. It's not going to appeal to readers. And readers, remember, stories are all about characters. Stories have to have interesting characters. And if you've been following this series, I've talked a lot about how you can make your characters more interesting and how you should have a give and take. You should have a sort of balance, and not every character has to be amazing. Not every character has to be, oh my God, you're so cool. You are so interesting. Tell me more about you. Not every character has to be that way. You can have characters that are one-offs, and there are plenty of ways that you can make those one-off characters even more interesting, because none of your characters should be boring. If a character is in a scene and serves no purpose to the story, no purpose to further the plot of the novel or the story along, my recommendation would be to cut that character out entirely. Remember that when you're writing short stories, it's always best to err on the side of having fewer characters rather than more, because again, having more characters, you're going to sort of muddy the waters, and readers are going to have a hard time gravitating to who the protagonist is. The reader is going to have a difficult time, especially if you have 10, 14 characters at the start of a short story. It's going to be impossible to figure out all those names. You can certainly do it with a novel, but if you're writing The Hobbit as a short story, there's no way a reader could even be bothered knowing all the dwarves' names. They wouldn't care about Biffer, Boffer, blah, 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 all their names, because it's just in a short amount of time, you have to be so hyper-focused in your short story. You have to have your protagonist character, you have to have your main players, you have to have your antagonists, you have to have your protagonist trying to accomplish something and the antagonist trying to prevent him or her from accomplishing his or her goal. And so short stories, you should definitely err on the side of having fewer characters rather than more. And sometimes this is feedback that we get from beta readers. Sometimes this is something that we notice when we're a few chapters in. And so I'm going to be giving you some tips and tricks on how to change your character a little bit, how to alter them slightly to make them more interesting. Remember, your characters have to be more memorable. And yes, that does mean being something more memorable than being simply the chosen one. We want characters that we can sink our teeth into. We want characters that are going to feel real, characters that are going to have strengths, flaws, characters that are going to have interests, characters who are going to have passion, characters who are going to have opinions. And sometimes these opinions might not be in alignment with what everybody else around them is believing. And this is going to make your characters more interesting. This is going to make your characters more believable, because I don't know anybody in this world who doesn't have a hobby who is just one note. So even your protagonist character should not be a one note character. Your side characters should not be one note characters. Your characters should have interests. They should have things that might relate to the progression of the plot, but they might also be side tangents. You might have a character that has a love for building trains in his or her basement. Now, I wouldn't recommend adding this information if it's not pertinent for the reader to know, but I believe that this is information that you as the author should know. You as the author need to know every last detail of your characters. Now, whether you choose to include this in a short story is up to you as the author. And sometimes I've written pages and pages and pages before I start to really get to know who my character is. And I end up finding that I typically have to trim back, or I have to start a little closer towards where the story is actually beginning. But again, none of this is wasted writing, because this is exploring and this is me getting to know my characters better. It's allowing me to understand how my character thinks, what my character's interests are, what my character's hobbies are. So there's plenty of character profiles out there that you can find online that I'm sure will help you with fully fleshing out your characters. Because again, we want to have fully realized characters. We don't want to have characters who are one-note characters. We don't want a character whose entire identity is, I want to be the very best. We want to have characters who that might be their goal. Their overarching big goal might be, I want to be the very best, like no one was before. But they also have to have something else that makes them tick. They have to have some other interests. So it's important to give your characters hopes, fears, passions, interests, hobbies, things that they believe that make them unique, because we want to see characters who are unique. We don't want to see characters who all think and act the same way. We don't want to have it would make no sense to have characters who are all, I like the color blue because blue is the best color. I like this. I like to eat apple pie because apple pie is yummy. Yum. We want you might have several characters who believe that apple pie is delicious, and several characters who might say blue is the best color, which I do believe blue is the best color. But your protagonist should be separate. Your protagonist you should have, to make some of your more boring characters. We certainly don't want any of our characters to be like, my favorite color is beige and I like watching Dr. Phil. And so here's an example of what a boring character might look like. So, scene change. So let's take the character Steve. Now, he's an average guy born in West Ohio, and he always wanted to move to New York to write. He's 5'2", works in an office, and boring, right? So having a character like that, we certainly don't want our protagonist to be average, boring, mundane. The last thing we want to do is set our characters in West Ohio of all places. So now I want you to channel the coolest person you can think. So if you have to close your eyes, use your mind, just think about who the coolest person is that you can think of. It might be someone you know personally. It might even be, and again, it's certainly perfectly okay to draw on people that you know personally. And again, thinking about people that you know, everyone that you know has interests. Everyone that you know has hobbies, they all have things that intrigue them, they have opinions. Again, everyone has an opinion, but everyone has an opinion on pretty much everything in today's age. That's why I'm sharing opinions right now. Maybe one of your protagonists has a YouTube channel while they secretly hunt ghosts, or while they track down monsters. They have a YouTube channel, or they have a diary, or they like to play charades. And so now I'm going to give you an example of how we can take boring Steve, right? 5'2", works in an office, from West Ohio. So now we're going to make Steve into the coolest, most interesting character that we can think of. And so I wrote this down, so I'm just going to read it off. So Steve grew up anywhere but Ohio. His wife left him to move to New York City, and she has been publishing poetry loosely stolen from Steve's alternative rock band, the Sheila Whalers. Although he has been writing songs for years, Steve suffers from terrible stage fright on account of hearing about his best friend's disappearance after a high school performance. Since then, Steve has slowly been playing more music, but blames himself for his friend's disappearance. He wants to go to New York to confront his ex-wife about her plagiarism, though he doesn't have the proof needed. So let's compare those two examples, right? The second example, Steve is now a lot more interesting. He has hopes, he has fears, he has a lot more detail. He's a much more interesting character because he has these things that make him unique. And the story might revolve around the relationship between Steve and his ex-wife. And we're already starting to see the plot of this story, this hypothetical story, starting to play out. And we're seeing tension already created very early on, just in how we've changed the life of Steve. Because Steve before was boring. Steve was pretty complacent, worked in an office, didn't have any outside interests. We didn't mention any of that. And so in the second example, Steve now plays in an alternative rock band. We understand that he has stage fright and he blames himself, which adds much more depth and makes him a much more interesting and intriguing character. He's no longer boring Bill paying bills, rooting for the Buffalo Bills. Now remember, it's also not just about the description of Steve. It's not just the way that we describe our characters. It also comes down to the way that our characters react to situations. So Steve could still be a very boring character if he said, "Oh, my ex-wife stole my songs and is publishing poetry. I'm just gonna sit here and drink lemonade and play here, and I'm not gonna go to New York." But the fact that we have Steve being as an interesting character now, he's willing to leave Ohio or wherever he's from, because interesting Steve is not from Ohio. Remember, nobody interesting comes from Ohio. In the example that I've given, I think there's a strong case to make that Steve is going to be our protagonist in the story, because the most interesting character in your novel, in your short story, has to be your protagonist. It doesn't make sense for it to be a side character. It doesn't make sense for it to be a character who comes in for one scene. Oh, the train conductor was the most interesting character in the entire novel. The protagonist was boring, but the train conductor who sold him the ticket and was on the train with him on the train ride across the country, he was the most interesting character. It's not going to do well, because readers want to be rooting for the protagonist, and they want to know the protagonist. We want to see a fully realized, a fully fleshed out protagonist, and you do this again by giving your protagonist strengths, weaknesses, hopes, fears, and giving them hobbies, giving them things that are extracurricular, giving them things that will allow them to have opinions. And maybe your protagonist has an opinion that they're willing to die for. I think broccoli is the worst vegetable ever, and I will fight any man who says otherwise. So give your characters likes, give your characters passions, give their characters opinions. So let me know in the comments down below, what opinion does your protagonist have that he or she is willing to die for? And of course, if you feel that this is extra and you feel that none of this information is pertinent to the story that you're trying to tell, if it's not something that adds to the narrative of your novel, of your short story, it might be something that you as the author just happen to know and keep that in the back of your mind as you're writing the story, as you're creating these situations for your character to overcome. And it's going to help you know how is your character going to react to the situation. And it might not be something that's ever addressed in the text. It's something that might never be outwardly said. Oh, Bob's favorite color is black because he's a punk rocker at heart and he hates his corporate job. So thinking about the way that your character reacts to situation, the way that your character behaves, the way that your character thinks, all these are going to be small, subtle details. So it doesn't have to be something so overboard, so over the top, but small, subtle details are able to help add intrigue and add mystery to an otherwise boring character. So that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, keep it spooky. And of course, here's your writing prompt for sticking all the way through the video. The Sheila Whalers were due on in 5 minutes. Steve blank. So set your timer and start writing. Who is it? Sorry, am I late?